Japanese Fugo incendiary balloons. The Fugo program was Japan's attempt to reach North America with unmanned weapons, and it remained a controlled secret under wartime censorship during 1944 to 1945, with fuller details emerging only after declassification and later historical work. The essential secrecy window runs from the first launches in November 1944 to Japan's surrender in August 1945. Followed by years of limited public awareness, as officials downplayed arrivals to deny feedback to the launch teams. The program's scale and methods were clarified post-war by recovered documents and later scholarship that traced sand ballast to beaches on Honshu and cataloged the device's engineering. Fewer than a tenth of the roughly 9,000 balloons likely reached the continent. Most caused little more than scattered brush fires and curiosity. The Oregon tragedy in May 1945 remains the sole fatal incident attributed to enemy action in the continental United States. Newspaper silence during the censorship period created an aura of mystery, but archival reporting, physical recoveries, and technical analysis show an intercontinental concept that largely failed to achieve operational aims. The design was ingenious and fragile at once. The paper envelope spanned about 33 feet, built from hundreds of panels glued with starch. A barometric system dumped sandbags to hold altitude, and a long fuse set off small incendiary or fragmentation bombs after release. The vehicle rode the newly mapped jet stream. The concept anticipated unmanned long-range strike by decades, but materials and weather made outcomes unpredictable. If success is measured by destruction, it was not successful. If measured by technical audacity, it marked the first practical intercontinental unmanned weapon. Had the concept achieved widespread fires, countermeasures would have followed the pattern already in place. Air patrols keyed to meteorological windows, interdiction of suspected launch areas, and civil defense fire suppression on high-risk days. The same weaknesses that limited results, thin materials, wind dependence, and non-steerable trajectories, would have remained exploitable even against a more aggressive campaign. Soviet anti-tank dogs. The program existed under wartime military secrecy, but its development path and combat record have been reported in sufficient detail to be evaluated. It was not a long-kept state secret after the war. Rather, it became the subject of conflicting claims, with later propaganda asserting successes that the field reports do not corroborate. Within the historical material provided, the strongest evidence depicts a short, fraught experiment from 1941 to 1942 that never met expectations in combat conditions. Proof against the myth of effectiveness rests on first-hand reports and unit correspondence describing failures under fire. Conditioning relied on starving dogs and rewarding them for seeking food beneath idling tanks, which did not translate to moving targets amid noise and gunfire. Diesel-conditioned animals sought Soviet armor that smelled familiar rather than German gasoline engines. Dogs balked, panicked, or returned to friendly lines. Trainers sometimes shot their own animals to prevent friendly casualties. Claims of hundreds of enemy tanks destroyed are not supported by cited documents in the record here, and the program appears to have been abandoned during the war.
The design solution was a mechanical trigger arm protruding from a vest carrying roughly a dozen kilograms of explosives intended to detonate under the hull near the tracks. Trials never resolved the core problem. The guidance system was a frightened, living creature driven into the noisiest, most hostile environment available. Other militaries explored similar ideas and terminated them at the testing stage. If the concept had succeeded tactically at scale, countermeasures would have been straightforward. Small arms fire against approaching animals, vehicle skirts and screens, deterrent fire patterns around halted armor, and policies to deny conditioning cues by masking odors or altering idling routines near front lines. The Great Panjandrum. The Panjandrum originated within Britain's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development and remained effectively secret to the public during wartime, with film and photographs entering the historical record after the conflict. The timeline is narrow. Concept in 1943, catastrophic trials through early 1944, and quiet termination. Its mystique grew from declassified footage and recollections rather than a long cloak of secrecy. Demonstrations themselves serve as proof against any myth of practical value. Surviving film and accounts depict rockets detaching, thrust asymmetry sending the device off course, and structural cables whipping free. A third wheel, extra rockets, and reinforcement did not cure the basic instability. Because the tests never incorporated a live explosive filling, there is no need to infer danger. The uncontrolled runs already document the decisive failure mode. The machine consisted of a pair of large wheels linked by a drum intended to be packed with explosive, with dozens of cordite rockets strapped around the rims for thrust. It was meant to roll off a landing craft, cross the surf, and strike concrete defenses at speed. The absence of stabilization and steering was not a quirk to be tuned out later. It was intrinsic to the concept. As such, it was not a successful secret weapon. Its value today lies as a study in what an unguided, multi-impulse rolling charge cannot do. Post-war documentaries and museum holdings have featured the footage precisely because it is visually striking. If the Panjandrum had somehow achieved controlled runs, defenders could have used anti-tank guns, artillery airbursts, ditches, angled obstacles, or simple beach obstructions to topple or divert it. V2 rocket, A4. The V2's development was secret through the 1930s test series and Peenemunde's program work up to operational use in 1944, with the propaganda name announced only after it entered service. Its secrets did not persist long after the war. Captured components, documents, and personnel quickly brought its details into Allied analyses and early Cold War programs. Myths surrounding decisive impact do not survive the production and effects record. The rocket was costly, complex, and unreliable in significant fractions of launches. Accuracy allowed only city-wide aiming. A few thousand firings over the course of the campaign inflicted terror and damage, but could not alter industrial balance or air superiority. The historical figures cited in the source, numbers produced, failure rates, cost relationships to the V1, and limited effect on specific strategic targets, are adequate to size the gap between reputation and result. Design-wise, the motor burned liquid oxygen and an alcohol-water mix, with peroxide-driven turbopumps and a steel chamber and nozzle. Guidance and electrical systems occupied a dedicated instrument section. An Amatol warhead sat under a nose fuse. Fins were clipped for rail transport limits. Production shifted underground after the 1943 Peenemünde raid, relying on forced labor with grim mortality. As a secret weapon in 1944-45, it was successful only as proof of principle for ballistic missiles. Captured rockets underpinned Allied tests and training, and derivative designs began in the Soviet program. If the weapon had arrived earlier, cheaper, and more accurate, effective countermeasures would still have centered on production and launch disruption, bombing of development sites, rail interdiction, and ground seizure of launch areas. Once airborne, 1944 defenses could not intercept it. Messerschmitt Me 262A, Schwobe. The Me 262 emerged from a pre-war project track that did not remain secret deep into the post-war period. By 1945, the Allies had captured and flown examples. Its operational secrecy window was effectively limited to the months between early 1944 production ramp and the collapse of German air operations in 1945. The record dispels the myth that it represented a withheld miracle capable of reversing the air war if only released earlier. Only about 1,400 airframes were completed, with a small fraction seeing combat. Engines were fragile due to material shortages and immature metallurgy. Sorties were limited by parts and fuel. Allied fighter sweeps and airfield attacks exploited takeoff and landing vulnerabilities. Political direction diluted fighter deployment by pushing for a light bomber role. The type's superiority in level speed did not overcome numbers, tactics, and reliability constraints. The airframe paired a sleek twin-engine layout with Junkers UMO 004 axial flow turbojets, offering speeds that outpaced piston fighters and armament configurations intended to break bomber formations. In service, unit performance could be impressive on a given day, but the systemic picture remained unfavorable. As a secret weapon, it was technically advanced without being strategically decisive.
If Germany had fielded reliable engines in quantity earlier, Allied counters already proven in 1944-45 would have remained relevant. Heavy strikes on production plants, railway cratering, airborne patrols over known bases, and tactics aimed at takeoff and landing phases. More jets in the sky do not erase industrial asymmetry.
I-400 submarine aircraft carrier. The I-400 class was conceived in secrecy with ambitions of global reach, and wartime security kept its details compartmented until capture and post-war scuttling. The secrecy window began with 1942 design decisions and ended in 1945-46 when the U.S. Navy took custody and sank the boats rather than allow other powers to inspect them at leisure. There is no myth to dispel about a battlefield debut. These submarines were finished too late and fielded too few to affect the war. The documentary record in the provided material makes the concept plain: a large undersea platform carrying folding seaplanes in a cylindrical hangar, launched by bow catapult for surprise raids. The unexecuted plan involved long-range strikes against the U.S. mainland or the Panama Canal. War reversals canceled the scale of the program. 3 were completed, and 2 operated briefly before surrender. Design details separates the class from ordinary submarines. A figure-8 hull section supported the centerline hangar. Siren floatplanes were designed for compact stowage with folding surfaces and quick preheat for engines. Compressed air catapults enabled deck launches after a brief surface prep. Armament included torpedo tubes, triple 25mm mounts, and a 140mm deck gun. The platform's intended effect was psychological and logistical rather than purely tactical. Scattered hits far from the front would force dispersal of U.S. resources. Had multiple boats executed raids, counteraction would have followed established anti-submarine practice combined with coastal air defense, increased maritime patrols on predicted arcs, radar pickets near likely launch points, and strikes on suspected forward fueling or rendezvous areas. The same compromises required for launch, surfacing, and deck handling would have exposed the boats to detection. Skinner's guided bomb. Project Pigeon was formally secret during the war, but was never fielded, and its apparatus later entered museum collections, ending the secrecy. The time frame is compact: a 1943 idea, a modest grant, laboratory demonstrations, and cancellation as other guidance approaches took precedence. Evidence in the record discounts any narrative that it flew in combat or achieved clandestine results. Skinner's demonstrations were effective in controlled settings, with birds pecking target imagery on small screens. Committees and officers remained unconvinced that an animal-in-the-loop guidance system was a viable operational path. The prototype's later donation to museums has made the project a well-documented curiosity rather than a hidden capability. The hardware was straightforward. A lens projected the forward view onto 3 screens and a missile nose. 3 pigeons were harnessed inside, their pecks registered by electrical contacts and translated into control inputs. Training used operant conditioning with valuable reinforcement to produce relentless pecking on the designated aim point. The intended benefit was improved accuracy for glide weapons without exposing pilots to low-altitude delivery. If such a system had reached combat, enemies would have no direct counter to the pigeons themselves beyond camouflage and decoying. The practical counters already available would have targeted delivery, hitting launch aircraft, jamming radar altimeters or range beacons if present, and dispersing high-value assets to reduce point target vulnerability.
Bat bombs. Project X-Ray operated with formal secrecy and Navy codename until its late 1944 cancellation, with details surfacing later through participant accounts and historical features. The secrecy covered acquisition of large numbers of bats, the design of incendiary microcharges, and trials at multiple sites. The record confronts 2 opposing myths. It was not a mere crackpot notion that never left the drawing board. Mock-ups and field tests demonstrated precisely the destructive mechanism envisioned, including an accidental base fire from escaped live-loaded bats. Nor was it an operational success. Competing priorities, Handling complications and the advent of faster strategic options ended the program before combat use. Design was tailored to Japanese urban construction. Mexican free-tailed bats were chilled for hibernation, fitted with small napalm charges in cellulose cases and stacked in a pod that opened under parachute for dispersal and roosting. Timers ignited charges within interior spaces unreachable by conventional incendiaries, multiplying small ignition points across a wide area. Team composition ranged from mammalogists to chemists. The effort evolved from Army to Navy oversight during its life. Krummlauf curved barrel rifle. The Krummlauf was a late-war project, not widely known outside technical circles until after the war, with surviving examples and testing records describing the actual performance. The secrecy timeline is short. Development from 1943, limited trials, and post-war U.S. ordnance evaluation. Any impression that it solved the problem of firing around corners does not survive post-war tests. The projectile tended to fracture under the imposed curvature, with halves separating at the canellar. Drilled vent holes ahead of the bend reduced pressure, but did not preserve projectile integrity or practical lifespan. Service life ran to only a few hundred rounds before failure. Accuracy and lethality at distance were poor by design. The device was for extremely close engagements, and even there produced inconsistent results. The attachment clamped to the STG/MP44 family, with a mirrored sighting arrangement so the shooter could aim without exposing the head. The infantry version used a 30-degree bend. A vehicle variant used 90 degrees for vertical mounting through armor ports. Early ideas about reduced diameter troughs yielded to full-bore curved section as tests disproved the smaller bore concept. The intended users included armored vehicle crews who needed a means to engage threats attempting to approach blind spots. Die Glocke, the bell. The story of Die Glocke is a post-war creation that did not exist in wartime public knowledge and only appears in modern accounts beginning around 2000. In other words, the secrecy is retrospective, a narrative of a secret that leaves no verifiable wartime footprint. Within the provided material, its core claims rest on a chain of assertions that cannot be inspected, purported interrogation transcripts that were transcribed but never copied, and were later amplified in English-language popular works. Proof against the myth rests in absence where presence would be expected. There are no authenticated design drawings, test logs, photographs, medical reports, or surviving hardware. Debriefed scientists left extensive records without mention of such a device.
Exotic effects, such as anti-gravity or time manipulation, do not align with known physics or with the technological evolution that followed. If such a capability had existed, its exploitation during 1944-45 would have been immediate. No trace of such an application appears. The design claims that do circulate, counter-rotating drums, a violet liquid codenamed Zerum 525, lethal biological effects, and tests in a circular rig near Project Rise remain uncorroborated in primary sources. And that's it for this video. We really appreciate you watching. If you found this one informative, consider passing it along to others who'd enjoy it, and leave a comment if there's a subject you'd like covered next.